All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another exciting topic for our Intro to College Psychology course that we're doing. This one is going to be on biological processes. And now that we have a better understanding of exactly how it is we diagnose and how exactly we go about looking at psychological disorders, our next step in the process is to really understand how that body plays a role, and really specifically the harmful dysfunction part of the diagnostic process. So if we look at our goals for the lesson today, it's two big goals. First of all, is to understand that processes of the body that impact our thoughts and behaviors, to understand what those processes are. And then secondly, to gain an understanding of how the harmful dysfunction criteria of diagnosis is met. I know when we talked about diagnostics, that part about the harmful dysfunction is often very confusing. That's not a term that we're familiar with, and especially when we talk about the body and how that can occur. So it's important today that we really talk in depth a little bit about how those harmful dysfunctions occur. We're gonna start today with the most specific part of how the body controls our thoughts and behaviors, and we'll work then to a bigger picture method. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go here. We're starting very specific, and then we'll move out to the larger parts of the body. All right, so if we're going to go specific, the very most specific part of the body when it comes to controlling behaviors is the neuron. This is what you're looking at right now, is the neuron. Um, some of this might be review for those of you that took biology. That's okay. That'll just mean you'll catch on a little bit faster. Neurons are just cells in our body that exchange signals with each other to connect our senses, organs, muscles, etc. So you have billions and billions and billions of these little guys all throughout your body that talk to each other, carry signals at a speed we can't even comprehend with the human mind to get our senses, organs, and muscles all to work in unison so that we can live our daily lives. As a matter of fact, uh, the brain itself has 100 billion of these little guys in it, all working together to run your body. It's kind of, to paint a metaphor, it's kind of like the game telephone. I know we all played that game growing up where somebody gets a message, they hand off the message to the next person, and then by the end of the game, it gets to the end, and that person will explain or exclaim what the message they received was. And if you win the game, that person will have the correct message. And obviously, if you lose the game, it's because somebody screwed up along the way. And really, at the very basic part of our discussion today is to keep in mind that anytime a harmful dysfunction is occurring, it is when one of those neurons or one of those body parts screws up that message, screws up what is supposed to be going on. So let's talk a little bit about what occurs in the neuron. So first of all, let's talk about the dendrite. Okay, we have our dendrites right here. They look like little antennas. That's basically exactly what they are. They work very much like the antennas on our phone. They are our information receivers. So much the way that an antenna on your phone would be in charge of receiving a signal, the same way these dendrites, these antenna-looking things, receive information. Next, we're going to go to the soma. That really is the nucleus of the cell. Anytime we talk about cells, you should know from basic biology that there needs to be some kind of nucleus. So this is the headquarters um, of the neuron, so the headquarters of the neuron. And the soma is in charge of interpreting or processing the message. Interpreting or processing the message. So it's received by the dendrite, sent to the soma where the message is made sense of, and then it will be sent onto the axons, okay, which is this long part right here, the axon. This really works kind of like the speaker in your phone. So it's a long fiber, and it is going to transmit or send the message. Okay, so the same way that when somebody calls you, that information comes through the antenna, gets sent to the processor in your phone, comes out your speaker. That would be the axon, sending the message on. And then this myelin sheath here, I'm not sure if you can really understand that from this drawing, but the myelin sheath is just a protective covering that is over the axon that really it really protects the axon from any damage and makes sure that the signal can move efficiently through the axon. This is really, in terms of speed, that's where the most important part of the neuron is. Now, I'm going to mention this. I'm not going to give you a specific definition for this, but these little guys right here, these are called synapses. Okay, these are just the little parts that the message jumps from to go to the dendrite. Okay, so moving down a little bit, this is exactly what we're looking at. Oop, I thought I had something there. Guess not. All right, so this is what it looks like in your body. So we have two of these little guys connected. So they come in through the dendrite, goes into the soma, processed, sent on through the axon, protected by the myelin sheath, jumps from the axes to the dendrite of the next cell, and the process happens all over again through billions of these things in less than a split second for you to move your body, to have feelings, whatever the case may be. Anything you do in the body is going to be, any movement for sure is going to be through this chain of messages. All right. So, moving on then, a couple things you need to understand about the communication between neurons. First of all is the threshold. Okay, the threshold is just the level of stimulation needed to trigger a response in your body. Believe it or not, your body is stimulated, your neurons are stimulated millions of times a day, and they don't always require an action from your body. I'm sure you've learned in physics, or you understand from physics, that especially in things like hearing, your body can't hear all sounds. Okay? If there's a volume that is too low, your body can't hear it. Okay? And actually, if there's a volume that's too loud, your body can't process it. Okay, so there is a threshold, there is a level of stimulation needed to trigger a response. Same thing in pitch. Most common example is a dog whistle. Okay, a dog whistle, you blow the whistle, it's at such a high pitch that it is not within the threshold level for the body. But dogs, having a little bit different wiring in the ears, they do hear it, and they can then respond to that whistle. Second, we have a resting potential. Any neuron that is not being used at the time has potential for energy. So this refers to a neuron that is not conducting a charge. It has resting potential, and it will actually have a slightly negative charge. So a very stable charge, but slightly negative. And then lastly, any neuron that is being used has an action potential. Now this refers to the axon specifically. So that's something you all need to be aware of, that responds or refers specifically to the axon. So depending on how long each individual axon is, how large the myelin sheath around that axon is, messages will travel at a different speed and efficiency through each axon. So obviously you want in your neurons to have a much higher action potential, and some disorders or some behavioral problems can be caused by having a slow action potential in your neurons. For instance, things like Parkinson's or things like, oh, now I'm blanking. Any kind of tick in the body that you have Tourette's, that's what I was trying to think of. Tourette's syndrome, where you get some kind of tic. Oftentimes, what that is it's a slow axon where the body, you might get these impulses all the time, but they're so quick that you don't notice them. Versus if they move so slowly, it screws up the message, and then you end up with some kind of nervous tic. So, and then once again, here's kind of a summary of how the messages communicate between neurons. The dendrite receives the message. The soma interprets the message. If the message is greater than the threshold, then the neuron fires. Okay, depending on the action potential, it determines how fast that message will fire. The terminal buttons release the message to the synapse where they are received by the next neuron through the dendrites, and the message goes from the brain to the body part that needs to be responding, and then the response from that body part occurs. All right, neurotransmitters. Okay, this is another very vital part of this whole system. The neurotransmitter actually just refers to the message itself. So if before, going back to our telephone kind of analogy, if we're looking at the neuron as being the people actually playing the game, the neurotransmitter is the message. These are actually chemicals that flow up and down neurons. All right, and when it comes to behavior, there's 4 main types of neurotransmitters depending on the type of message, depending on the type of response that the body is requiring. And then because of that, if you have a lack of these in your body, they can also cause disorders that have a certain type of reaction. So first of all, serotonin. Am I going to go in here? I just have to. If you didn't get that definition down already, you might have to just rewind the video a little bit and go back to that. So serotonin. Serotonin is generally an inhibitory neurotransmitter, means it slows the body down. It's specifically used for controlling sleep. So when your body's trying to sleep, serotonin might go to your body parts to kind of calm everything down, tell you that you need to start sleeping. It also is in charge of dreaming and helps us regulate our emotions. So dopamine is the next type. It's important with thinking, perception. It's connected to muscle activity as well. This is probably the neurotransmitter that we see the most common a lack of in the system when it comes to personality disorders. Somebody who perceives the world to be incorrect. Somebody who maybe looks at themselves in the mirror and sees somebody who's very fat even though they're 100 pounds, or somebody who is paranoid in the world around them might have a lack of dopamine in their system, in which case that could be treated through drugs that will increase the level of dopamine. Next is GABA, or GABA, which stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid. This is also inhibitory. It regulates your anxiety. Okay, so it keeps control of your anxiety, keeps your worry down, allows you to not worry over every little thing. And I think you clearly could see how a lack of that, or in other instances, too much of GABA could also cause problems. So if you didn't have enough, you'd worry about everything. And if you had too much, if you had hyper-GABA syndrome, you could actually get to a point where you just don't give a crap about anything, which would not be a good thing either. And then lastly, acetylcholine is involved in learning, memory, and muscle movement. So obviously, somebody who has a learning disorder, one potential problem could be a lack of acetylcholine, is a neurotransmitter in the body. If you have memory problems, if you have problems with your muscle movement, any one of these things could be caused by a lack of acetylcholine in the body. All right, so 4 major neurotransmitters. These are the message. These are the things they control. And if you have problems with your messaging system, with your nervous system, it could be caused by a lack or too much of one of these neurotransmitters. All right. The next step then is looking at what these messages and what these relay stations make up. Okay, so the biggest part of this is called the nervous system. Hopefully, that's a term you've heard before. The nervous system is made up of two central components. First of all, we have the central nervous system. The central nervous system, which essentially is the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so the brain and the spinal cord right there. So that's our central nervous system, and 99% of all the neurons in your body are located right there, meaning 99% of the message receptors are right there. Funny little side story that I just thought of as I'm talking about this. So a couple years ago, about 5 years ago, I'm getting a tattoo done on my back, and it is right along the spinal column. It's located in my body about right there. Okay, and I've had two tattoos before this, and I'm thinking, okay, it's no big deal. It's not going to be a problem. And I go in, and the guy, gives me the spiel he always gives me about, if there's too much pain, let me know. We'll stop. We'll take a break. We'll take a timeout, and whatnot. I've never had that problem before, and about half an hour into this tattoo, I'm dying. It's one of the most painful experiences of my life. And so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, my God, what is so different about this? And so I say to this guy, which I've gotten to know over the years, and I say, I got to stop. And I looked at him, I said, this is crazy. This is so different. I feel like I'm getting a tattoo on every single inch of my body. And he looks at me as though it was like the easiest answer in the world. He goes, well, if you think about it, you're letting me put a needle into your central nervous system. And looking at it now, it makes total sense. Okay, because where he was putting a needle, there's receptors that were sending pain signals out to every inch of my body. Which, if I had known that before getting the stupid thing, I probably would have shifted it to a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. But that's neither here nor there, just a funny side note. But actually pretty relevant to this conversation about the central nervous system and how it has the most, by far, 99% of our neurons, and it sends the signals to the rest of the body. All right. Central nervous system, major part of the nervous system. The other part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. And essentially what we have here is just all the nerves that transfer info to and from the central nervous system. Okay, so the nerves that transfer info to and from the central nervous system. So essentially, it's everything that's connected right to the spinal cord or to the brain, the major parts. You kind of see some of them, all of our major organs, the lungs, the bladder, the heart. Okay, they send all these signals through to the spinal. I mean, the way I look at it is like this. So back in the day, before we had airplanes, before we had all kinds of, trucking industry and things like that. The way that everybody got any good or any manufactured product to a factory or a warehouse was through a railroad. And so the way I look at the central nervous system is kind of like back in those days. You have all these smaller companies, the eyes and the bladder, and the heart up here, and they're all doing their own thing, and they have products that benefit the company and benefit the factory. And for those businesses that are close to the factory, which is the brain, they'll just send it right on to the brain. However, if you're too far away, say you're down here, by the bladder, you can't get there, but you can get to the nearest railroad station, which is right here to the spine. So you'll send it on over to there, the railroad, the spine, and they'll send it on up to the factory. So that's always the way I kind of look at it, an easy way to remember what the purpose of the peripheral nervous system is. The peripheral nervous system actually breaks down into two smaller parts, the somatic system and the autonomic. I feel like these are two easily understood differences. The somatic system deals with movement or sensory information. Really anything to do with anytime any body part moves or anytime any body part um, gets any kind of sensation or builds a perception, that's involved in the somatic system. The autonomic system, on the other hand, is always going. I always look at autonomic, the word auto, as automatic. It's all the functions of the body that have to happen for you to live and happen automatically. Things like breathing, digestion, um, reproduction, anything in your body that is involuntary that happens without you knowing it. It happens constantly for your survival. All right, take a break, a short break here, to tell you an interesting story. Some of you may have heard by now. I hope you understand how your body is really a pretty impressive interconnected network of all kinds of workers. It's kind of like a company of all these workers. They're involved, and your body is this product, this thing that's they're making move and making work. Now, the brain, and this is kind of our transition into the brain really is the main boss. It's the operator of that business. And the brain is this amazing, amazing thing. And there's no better evidence of that than this tale of Phineas Gage back from the 1850s, rather. So in 1850, Phineas Gage, um, he worked on the railroad. He was a foreman working on the railroad. And what they were doing is they had to level out areas because you can't put a railroad over mountains. So as they traveled out west, they had all these mountains, and what they had to do is they had to make room by blowing up these mountains for the railroad. So one day Phineas is out there and he's setting the dynamite up to blow some mountain, gets the mountain out of the way. And what he does is he's using this big tamping rod, which ends up being this big red thing. So he has this tamping rod, and he's tamping the dynamite down into the ground to try and make sure that it gets deep enough to blow up a wide enough space. Well, what happens is, as he's doing that, he hits some kind of rock, some kind of hard object, which makes a small spark, but a spark big enough nonetheless to ignite the dynamite. Okay, and what the dynamite does is it explodes, and this tamping rod in his hand blows up straight up into the air and ends up going right through his skull. And this is actually what you see here from various angles, is this tamping rod that went through his skull. Now you would think, no way could a person survive this. Well, he did. He survived a long time, I guess, for anybody living at that age. He did lose his right eye, or left eye, I guess, as he was looking at it, or wasn't looking at it. So lost his left eye. But the interesting thing about this is, because he had severe damage to the part of the brain that controls your personality, his personality changed completely. His friends and family said he used to be such a fun, happy-go-lucky kind of guy, and he became a very different, very quiet, a guy almost absent of personality. And it's very interesting to see how your brain will adapt, and your brain has specific sections in it that are in charge of very specific functions. Okay, and that's kind of where we're going to go next. Is we're going to travel through the brain and talk about this important epicenter to our bodies, and talk a little bit about what is controlled in each section, and then therefore, if there's damage to each section, I guess at this point I don't want to have to stop each time and say, this is what it controls, and if this part of the brain wasn't working correctly, somebody'd have an issue with behavior where they weren't doing this. So just understand that anything I say in terms of this is what the body does, if there's a problem with it, your behavior is not going to do this, or you're not going to have that, and that is your harmful dysfunction right there. All right, starting first with the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain. It's that kind of spongy, stereotypical part of the brain. If you went and you asked a bunch of kindergartners to draw you the brain, they would probably just draw the cerebral cortex because that is, commonly viewed as being the brain. Along with the cerebrum, it surrounds the hindbrain and the brain stem. And the most important part of the cerebral cortex is it is involved in our higher level thinking processes. Okay, so it's involved in our higher level thinking processes, and really, I believe that this is what makes humans human. Our ability to think logically and with reason, our ability to think through problems, that is part of what makes humans human. So our excelling cerebral cortex, huge part of what makes humans human. Next, we have the corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum is a band of fibers that connects the left and the right hemispheres in the brain. It's so important to us because there's certain things that the left part of the brain is in charge of, and then there's certain things that the right part of the brain is in charge of. And if you didn't have some way to connect and some way for them to communicate, you couldn't be able to do anything you wouldn't have any way to multitask. Okay, because there's no way that your brain could communicate and do things at the same time. Okay, so this is the part of the brain that allows our bodies to multitask. We can walk and talk at the same time. As I'm sitting here today, talking to you, I'm reading from a note card. I'm, kind of pacing back and forth. I'm doing, from a body standpoint, a lot of multitasking. Things that we wouldn't normally see as multitasking, but are. Now, ironically, which won't be surprised to some of you, in women, the corpus callosum is thicker. It's thicker in women, which allows them a greater capacity to multitask. So, for those of you that, every time someone says, "Oh, well, you're female, you can do that. You can multitask." You can tell them, "Well, yes, because of my corpus callosum, it's very thick." Um, and there actually is a little bit of scientific evidence to why females can multitask better than men. All right, moving on then to the lobes of the brain. So if we look at, we had the hemispheres, we had the covering. Now we're going to break down into each specific region in the brain is actually in charge of very different processes in the body. So there are four main lobes that make up the two hemispheres in our body: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Okay, first of all, in the frontal lobe, that is where the planning of movements occurs. All right, that's a little bit smaller to make room. This is where the planning of movements occurs. Uh, this is where our working memory operates. Okay, all the events that have, so working memory is just all the events that happened recently, so things that are fresh in our minds. And then this is also the part of our brain that controls personality and emotion. So not surprising, you look at Phineas Gage, severe damage to the frontal lobe has an impact on his personality. Okay, second we have our parietal lobe, which really is going to be in charge of senses and sensation. So any kind of sensation that comes through the body's receptors. So by now you should know, every part of your body has different receptors for sensation. So all of those signals end up in the parietal lobe, where it gets processed and then sent back to the body to give it an appropriate response. Then we have our occipital lobe, which is really in charge of vision. Okay, our occipital lobe is in charge of vision. Our temporal lobe in charge of hearing and spatial relationships. Spatial relationships really just has to do with your understanding of the space you're living in. Things like depth perception, peripheral vision, Your understanding of the space around you really comes from the temporal lobe. All right. Now we're going to look at a more general view of the three major parts of the brain. We've been focusing mostly in the forebrain, but I do want to mention the important parts, because really when you look at it, most people when they think of the brain, come on, Marker, just think of that big spongy part, which was really the cerebral cortex, as I mentioned earlier. But actually, this midbrain and hindbrain are all part of the brain, and it's an important part of the brain, and important for you to understand the processes that go on there as well. So let's start with the hindbrain first of all, made up of the medulla, the cerebellum, the pons, and the reticular activating system, or the RAS. So first of all, and you should probably write all this down, even though I'm not going to write it on the board, you have the medulla. The medulla regulates involuntary functions such as breathing, heart rate, swallowing, or coughing. It helps out with all those processes. Then you have the pons. The pons is basically the bridge connecting the lower and the higher parts of the brain. It passes messages and helps produce chemicals for sleep. Then we have the reticular activating system, or just the reticular formation, as it says on our little diagram. I always call the RAS the Paul Revere of the body. Its basic function is to tell the midbrain and the forebrain, there's a message coming. Okay, it preps everybody. It's kind of like, the bell at a fire department. Normally, the firefighters are kind of sitting around, they're waiting for something to go wrong. And then that bell goes off and it says, hey, we need to get ready to leave. That's basically what the reticular activating system does. It says, hey, get up, get ready to go. Here comes a message. Prepare for it. So that's the role of the RAS. And lastly, the cerebellum is very important in terms of posture and balance. It makes sure that the body stays balanced, and we can do things like stand and walk very easily, even things like ride bikes. For those of you that don't ride bikes for a while, you get on your bike, it takes just a second, your cerebellum remembers how to balance on the bike, and you go on. Then we have the midbrain, which, as I mentioned, is right here. It's this orange part. And essentially, the midbrain, the purpose of the midbrain is just to serve as a relay station. So information comes in through the hindbrain, and it's basically, it comes into the midbrain, and the midbrain looks at it's a lot like the mailroom, to be perfect. I know by now you're probably getting sick of analogies, but I really believe that kind of understanding roles in the real world, especially the ones that work really well with body parts, it's not a bad thing to look at them in that way. I really look at the midbrain, that is, as being kind of like the mailroom, where mail comes in and it gets sorted by zip code, and then within the zip code it gets sent to the proper spot. So really, the message is going to come in, the midbrain's going to look at it and say, okay, this is the part of the forebrain that it needs to go to, and it'll send the message on there. So then lastly, with the brain, we do have our forebrain. So this is where most of the action in our brain takes place. This is where most of the message processing and the interpreting and the actions, the root of all the actions in our body take place, and therefore also has the most drastic impact on our behaviors. We're going to start, first of all, with the thalamus. For those of you that can't see that, that's Thalamus. It is the processing center for processing sensory input. Okay, so really it's the processing any sensation message that we have, anything that comes from the body, so anything that is tasted, touched, felt, anything that is seen or heard, those messages go right to the thalamus. So I mean, really, it is the primary source. It's the prime primary area where all messages in the body are processed. Essentially, that's, anything that comes in the brain, it's given to thalamus and said, you know what, thalamus, make sense of this message. Next, we have the hypothalamus, same spelling as the thalamus, only with hypo, H-Y-P-O, in front of it. It controls bodily functions of survival. Okay, so it deals with bodily functions that focus on survival. So things like eating, drinking, temperature, and last but not least, sexual arousal. Now, I know this is probably something, well, sexual arousal, why has he got to say that in school? But when you think about it, I mean, from a non-sexual way, even though the word is there, I mean, that's a very important part of survival. Without developing, that desire, without developing that need for the physical contact, no reproduction happens. No offspring are created, and the human race as we know it would cease to exist. So just that part of the brain, the part that creates a sexual arousal, without that, if everybody overnight developed a harmful dysfunction in our hypothalamus, we could envision a situation where the human race would, over a couple generations, simply go away. All right, next we're going to go to the hippocampus. Okay, this is where long-term memories are formed. So this is the part of the body that forms long-term memories. And I say that this is the part of the brain that prevents our body from being hoarders. Okay, you've all seen that show Hoarders, where everybody, seems to collect an ungodly amount of things. Our brains could do that. Our brains could remember an insane amount of things, but they're not all necessary, and they're not all healthy for us to remember either. So really, what the hippocampus does is any memory that we have for longer than about a week or so, the hippocampus looks at it and says, well, we don't really need that. We can get rid of that. Unfortunately, some of you, I mean, that's exactly why some people have problems at school. Is you might study something, and at the time you're not thinking it's very important to you. That's your perception of what you're learning. Is it's not very important to you. You don't need to remember it. And then a week later, when the test comes, you don't remember it because your hippocampus, believing that perception, has said, no, we don't need it. Okay, and has gotten rid of it. All right. Lastly, the last thing we're going to talk about in the forebrain, because we've already covered the corpus callosum, we've already covered the cerebral cortex, and we're going to talk about the pituitary gland with the endocrine system next. The last is the amygdala. Okay, so it processes emotions, and most importantly, it produces and regulates negative emotions, such as fear or anger. So the amygdala, I will repeat, produces and regulates negative emotions such as fear or anger. So you can imagine a situation where if somebody had a damaged amygdala or a malfunctioning amygdala, they might be a particularly angry person or maybe overly fearful of things. Okay, so just an example of how that harmful dysfunction comes into play. All right, so that pretty much ends our discussion of the nervous system, ends our discussion of neurons. Now we're going to move on to the other major communication system that helps regulate our body, and that is the endocrine system. The endocrine system, very, very similar to the nervous system in terms of, you have these centers where messages go to. You have these messages that are sent. It's very much that telephone type analogy still holds true. Really, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the differences. So the differences between the endocrine and the nervous system. In the nervous system, the center of all the messages is the brain. That's the final destination, or the destination for every message, versus in the endocrine system, there's these different glands. So I just define glands as parts of the body where messages are produced and sent to parts of, okay, so specific parts of the body where the messages are produced, sent to other parts of the body where they receive the message and do whatever the gland tells them to do. So the gland is the center. The hormones are the actual message. So if we look at that as being the message versus neurotransmitters being the message. As I'm standing here, it occurs to me I didn't explain the difference between the method of travel. So neurotransmitters, we said jump from neuron to neuron. Hormones go through the bloodstream. One thing that's different as well about the endocrine system is glands can adapt to who you are as a person. So depending on what age you are, what stage in development, what sex you are. So for instance, the easiest example, are sex glands. Everybody has sex glands. If you are a male, those sex glands will produce testosterone. And if you are female, it will produce estrogen. Okay? Testosterone is a hormone that causes a very specific reaction when it gets to the different parts of the body. It causes hair growth in specific areas, causes certain things to happen to your vocal cords, all kinds of things. Versus estrogen, it will cause similar types thing, hairs to grow in certain places, certain part of your body to grow or shrink, depending on what sex you are. And then lastly, we have the pituitary gland, which really is the master gland of the endocrine system. It is the main gland where everything is processed and basically controls the endocrine system. I call this our Mr. Volk gland. So if I refer to that as our Mr. Volk gland, the reason I do that is because if we're looking at the body as our school district, I know this may actually, no, I take that back. That is not our last analogy. So if we're looking at the body as being our school system, at the top you have the brain. Okay, the brain is in charge of our entire school district, so the brain in this instance would be Mr. Botts. Okay, Mr. Botts is in charge of everything, all the different systems of the brain. Okay, then you have the person that is in charge of just our level, our school, so the high school level. The person that would be Mr. Volk's supervisor, his boss, which would be Mr. Valentine, who in this analogy would represent the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus really is in charge of both a major part of the nervous system, but also regulating the endocrine system or making sure the pituitary gland does his job. Okay, I say his because I'm talking about Mr. Volk. Obviously, your pituitary gland does not have a specific sex. Okay, so then that leads us to the endocrine system, which really in this example, the endocrine system is LCCPA, and our fearless leader, Mr. Volk, therefore the Mr. Volk gland. All right, last slide. Actually, I take that back. Last slide where you have to write. All right, so now that we have all this stuff, great. We know that what the body's supposed to do. What the heck are we going to do with it? This is where a very specific field of psychology comes into play, which is called behavioral genetics. So it's a field of science where researchers attempt to explain behaviors through looking at the differences in their genetic makeup and environmental upbringing. So essentially, okay, based on who you are as a human being, and I mean literally who you are, your bodily makeup, or how you were brought up as a child, how that impacts your behavior. So a couple things you need to know about behavioral genetics. hopefully some of this is a review. So you need to understand everybody has is made up of DNA. Okay, it's the molecule that contains the genes. So all the genes in our body control all the characteristics. Okay, all of our features, our skin color, our hair color, our eyes, everything is located in our genes. So a gene is a stretch of DNA that produces a specific protein in the body that causes the traits. You need to understand the difference between a genotype and phenotype. So a genotype is the genetic code within an organism. It's basically the plan for the organism for what it's going to be. The phenotype is the observable manifestation of the organism. I know that probably sounds really confusing, so here you go. Your last analogy of this lesson, the phenotype is like a blueprint for a house. It's a sketch on a piece of paper. It's not usually 3D, or I guess it could be nowadays, but generally it's just on a piece of paper. It has a bunch of dimensions on it. It's just the plan for the house versus the actual house, once it's built, that's the phenotype. So within the DNA, you have a genotype, which is the code that's written for the organism. And then the phenotype is what we actually see. So it'd be like a code written, for blonde hair, blue eyes, etc. But then the phenotype is actually, what you have. Because there might be genotypes written for different different traits. So the genotype and the phenotype might not always link up. In behavioral genetics, they're going to look at heritability, which is the likelihood of behaviors or characteristics given a certain makeup. So given that I have a certain genotype, certain genes, or a certain DNA, what's the likelihood that I will behave a certain way? Or looking at it more real world, given the fact that you have the similar DNA or similar genetic makeup to your parents, what's the likelihood that you're going to act and think like them? A couple ways we do this. Through twin studies, okay? We can compare behavioral differences between twins. If they are exact twins, obviously that would be more helpful because their genetic makeup would be the same. If they are simply fraternal twins, that is equally as useful because we compare those types of twin studies. I don't know why I'm blanking on the term for exact twins, but you understand what I'm saying, so we'll continue. And then equally as useful then is our adoption studies. Basically the same. You look at twin studies, only you can compare adopted siblings to non-adopted siblings. So if you can think of somebody that's adopted, do they act pretty much the same way as their non-adopted siblings? Do they act similar to the parents that raised them? Things like that can really bring some insight into behavioral genetics and how much our genetic makeup and our bodily processes cause our behaviors. All right, so there you go. The body processes, everything that you could ever want to imagine about what causes the body or what parts of the body cause certain behaviors in us in our daily lives. So for the test then, couple things. You'll want to be able to identify the major parts of both the nervous and endocrine systems. You'll want to understand how your body communicates, the process that is for both the nervous and endocrine systems. And then lastly, you need to be able to identify what part of the body is experiencing a harmful dysfunction. So if I was to say, Jimmy is experiencing these symptoms, the doctor believes that there's a problem with his endocrine system. What part of the endocrine system is there a problem with? You need to be able to identify that. Or, the doctor believes there's a problem in the forebrain, causing Jimmy to experience severe anger. And I'll give you some multiple choice, and you would simply circle amygdala, whatever that one was. All right. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. I'm here to help. As soon as you feel comfortable that you can show your ability on these 3 points, come and talk to me. We'll set up our time and take that test, and then we'll be done with biological processes. All right. Have yourself a wonderful day. Bye.